Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim! Folytatjuk munkánkat a délutáni szekcióval. Ugye az ebéd utánra halasztottuk az alapvető jogok védelmét, így kedves kollégák, most rátérünk a következő napirendi pontunkra, melynek
We're going to move to the next item of the agenda, and we're going to hear from Dirk Allertz, Europol Fundamental Rights Officer. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you about your role as Fundamental Rights Officer with Europol. Please, 10 minutes at the most. After that, the floor will be open to members of the JPSG. Members of national parliaments are invited, who wish to take the floor, are invited to fill out the speaker request form. And members of the European Parliament, you can just raise your hands. Mr. Allertz, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, dear co-chairs and members of the JPSG. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor and for the invitation to participate in this important meeting. It is the second time I have the opportunity to give feedback of my activities as a Fundamental Rights Officer of Europol since the establishment of this function and my appointment to the office. Before I dive into my tasks, I will first focus on the realization of my vision as a Fundamental Rights Officer. Maybe some of you may remember that from last year that my vision is very simple. Fundamental rights, it takes all of us. Before you sits a happy Fundamental Rights Officer. Of course, we are not there yet, but Europol made good progress in the realization of this idea. Most important is that the staff are much more aware of my tasks and role and don't hesitate to contact me. They do so if they hesitate if a process or a tool is compliant with fundamental rights. This made it, for instance, also possible to adapt some processes in a way that a Fundamental Rights Officer is now included officially in processes as use of Article 25 of the Europol regulation. This is the exceptional data transfer to third countries, or the assessment of AI tools used or developed by Europol, the development of new policies, and also very important, the whistleblower procedure. I can also count on an internal informal network. As I'm not a lawyer, this network allows me to check the legality of my advices and reports, and the participants in this network are very glad that they can contribute to fundamental rights compliance of Europol. So I really trust Europol staff, but of course not blindly. I continue to check on a daily basis the operations Europol supports. For 2024, 5 times I had to ask extra information, and finally one item was passed to the DPO, and the 4 others were checked by me and revealed to be negative or were corrected. Last year, I told you that the guest officers represent a slightly higher risk. Every week, I check the 3 reports the coordinators sent to me, 1 for Italy, 1 for Greece, and 1 for East Europe. The monitoring of these reports didn't lead to any official intervention of my side. Another indication of the realization of my mission is the invitations I receive to participate and monitor operational meetings. This is now routine for the Europol Counter-Terrorism Center, but I was also invited by a team of the Operational and Analysis Center and even by a unit within the administrative department. Other invitations will follow because all heads of department and some of the heads of unit have followed in the meantime a training on fundamental rights and have showed interest in this kind of meetings. What I didn't do yet this year is a field visit to one of the spots of the deployment of the guest officers. This will be done in the beginning of next year, because I want to coordinate with the data protection function and also with the FROs, the fundamental rights officers of other agencies. Monitoring has become more or less a routine task, but this is not the case for the advices the organization expects from me. It is a much more difficult task that is only possible to do with the support of my internal and external network. Most challenging is for sure the advice on the establishment of working arrangements. I always give two separate advices, one very early in the procedure, preferable before the negotiations start, and an official one before signing the arrangement. To do so, I rely on many sources, as the United Nations periodic country reports, the yearly reports of the United States Department of State, the Political Transformation and Human Freedom Index, but also reports of NGOs as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. I also have to take into account the strategies and policies of the Council, the Commission and the Parliament. I also establish a relationship with the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights. If possible, I also look for assessments done by other agencies as Frontex and the European Asylum Agency. You can imagine that not all these sources have the same opinion. Finding the right balance and taking into account operational needs of Europol and the Member States is not an easy task. This year, I gave 2 preliminary advices and 3 official ones on working arrangements. Another kind of advice that demands a lot of attention is linked to innovation and new technologies. As you know, a fundamental rights impact assessment is required if Europol deploys or develops new tools using AI. There is still no official template or methodology, so I developed it myself at first, but later used the more or less identical methodology developed by the Strategic Group on Ethics of the European Clearing Board. It is not perfect and will have to evolve further, but for now it helps me to write advices for the AI tools that we already use in Europol, and as the Executive Director said already this morning, at this moment we use 7 AI tools in Europol. 2 times this year I was also asked by the Executive Director to deliver an urgent advice for the use of Article 25, so the exceptional data transfer to third countries. Although this advice is not always mandatory, the organization thinks it's a good practice and the internal processes will be adapted in this way. Also, other non-mandatory recommendations were delivered for processes and activities of the organization. Some on my initiative, some on the initiative of the units or the staff. Examples are the OSINT and social media monitoring for child sexual abuse and terrorist content online, advice on the external strategy, and the internal processes on working with private parties. To be able to realize my vision, training in fundamental rights for all staff is very important. These trainings have 2 different objectives. The first one is to enlarge the knowledge about fundamental and human rights, but more important is to have an impact on the attitude and values of the staff. I try to combine the 2. I continued the training for newcomers. 4 sessions per year are planned, and every time between 10 and 20 persons attend this training. A lot of energy and time was spent on the senior management training. 2 sessions were organized for in total 21 managers, the Executive Director, the 3 Deputy Executive Directors, all heads of department, and some heads of unit of the Operational Directorate participated in this 2-day course. The evaluation of the participants was positive, and my impression is that there is a more positive attitude towards myself and the values enshrined in the Charter. As planned already last year, the mandatory training of all staff processing data will start in 2025. The course is already prepared, at least for the knowledge part. I think it's also an important task for me to promote Europol or to explain how Europol works in full compliance with fundamental rights. I was present in several conferences and delivered presentations, for instance, in the Justice and Public Safety Artificial Intelligence Summit and an online conference organized by the Fundamental Rights Agency. In the beginning of the year, I was invited by one of the fractions of the European Parliament to talk about fundamental rights in law enforcement. I also gave a lecture for American senior officers on human rights training for law enforcement. I already told you that I use a methodology developed by a working group on ethics. I participate actively in this group composed of academics and law enforcement. I have also very good contacts with my colleagues of Frontex and the Asylum Agency. We have established a network between us, supported very actively by the Fundamental Rights Agency. Besides the regular meetings, 4 times a year, we now also have thematic meetings. We are now discussing how we can better support each other when organizing field visits. To conclude, already last year I mentioned that the risk assessment shows a low risk for fundamental rights violation by Europol staff. But we have to stay vigilant and keep monitoring as much as possible. Positive in the increasing awareness of Europol staff is the increasing awareness of Europol staff, probably linked to the communication and training activities. Thank you, and of course I'm open for all questions.
Köszönjük szépen Alerts úr előadást.
Thank you, Mr. Alerts, for that presentation. And now I open the floor for debate. 1 minute each to make sure we can fit everybody in, please. We're going to ask the questions first, and then Mr. Alerts will answer all the questions in one go. First to get the floor, Marika Alerts.
Képviselő, tessék parancsolni, képviselőasszony.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Alerts, for your briefing and your introduction. I read in the 2023 annual report for your office, and also based on what you just said, that there are several passages on the working arrangements with third countries and private partners. And I was wondering whether you could provide further details about the reasons for assessing the human rights compliance in third countries. Does this primarily relate to the transfer of data to the third countries, or are there other reasons for monitoring fundamental rights standards in these countries? And then secondly, what would the effects be of these assessments of fundamental rights situations in third countries? How would this influence Europol's work? And once again, does this only relate to the transfer of data to these third countries, or could a negative assessment by your office also have other consequences, for example, when it comes to extradition? Thank you very much.
Köszönjük szépen, most felkérem Bernardo.
Thank you. Mr. Fernando Blanco.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. In April, Europol asked governments to act against end-to-end encryption in messages. I'd like to ask whether you have an opinion on this position, because in the first semester of the year, the European Court of Human Rights actually came to the opposite conclusion. In a case against Russia, ending this encryption would be a disproportionate measure given Article 8, because people have a right to privacy and they should be able to communicate freely and openly. People say that social media are like the streets, they need to be monitored, so messages are like our homes, private messages are like our homes. So having police in the streets, if there's a criminal in an area, that doesn't mean that police can just go into everyone's houses. So
Não se tratem todos como potenciais.
So we shouldn't treat everyone like a potential suspect. That's just my overall opinion. And I just wanted to get an answer to that. Thanks.
Köszönjük, és utolsó felszólaló.
Thank you. And two more speakers. José Luis Carneiro from Portugal.
Senhor Presidente.
Chair, representatives of the different member states. This may be one of the most relevant topics when it comes to rule of law, defense of rule of law, and preservation of fundamental rights. So the question I have deals with the following. Protection of personal data and privacy is a constitutionally assured right, and it's part of our fundamental charter. But we also know that the application of the law is sometimes difficult when they need to be effective in their investigations. When it comes to dispensing justice and applying the law in cases of international organized crime, that's very difficult because nowadays these highly organized groups are increasingly making use of encrypted communication pathways. So I want to know how Europol is dealing with this very sensitive issue, given that the European Court of Justice has been coming up with opinions which, if applied as stated, would imply a loss of efficacy in fighting crime, specifically when it comes to drug trafficking and human trafficking, amongst other criminal threats. Thank you.
Köszönjük. Most pedig
Thank you. And the last speaker, Alexander van Matten, Netherlands.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, Chair. The Dutch delegation from the first chamber is interested in artificial intelligence, AI, and how Europol is approaching it, bearing in mind human rights. Because I'd like to hear how you're approaching this topic. I'd just like to hear more about it in general. Thank you.
köszönjük szépen, most pedig megadom azt.
Thank you. And I now give the floor once again to Mr. Allets.
Szóljon, tessék parancsolni, öné a szó.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Yes, the reasons for fundamental rights assessment for third countries. We at Europol, in our regulation, but also in the treaty and everywhere, you find things about fundamental rights, the respect of fundamental rights. This is really the core value of the European Union. So it is also natural that if there is an arrangement with a third country, that we look at the fundamental rights, that we do a fundamental rights assessment, not only on our processes, but we also have to look, of course, at the situation in the third country. But again, and this is also an answer to other questions, there is always a balance to find. And in my assessment, in my advice that I write to the organization, I always try to find this balance, and that means that maybe I say that there have to be some precautions when dealing with third countries. And to be clear for everyone, data protection and privacy, this is also looked at, of course. This is done by the Data Protection Office. I'm looking at the other fundamental rights. And there I try to give an advice in the sense that there has to be some precautions when projects are set up or whatever. But I always do this assessment because it's necessary. What is the effect? Well, the effect is that my advice always goes in the direction of some advice to the organizations how to deal in certain cases. And for instance, if there's still the death penalty in that country, that we have to be very careful if there is exceptional transfer of data to that country. So these are the kind of advices that I give. For the end-to-end encryption technology, and in particular, of course, encryption is not bad per se. However, criminals or cyber criminals abuse the technology and develop the technical developments to facilitate their criminal activities regardless the field. Europol and the European law enforcement community are neither against encryption nor for weakening of encryption or of cyber security, nor are we advocating for backdoors. The debate is not on either safety or security. We advocate for a technical solution that entails both security and lawful access by design. Privacy-preserving technologies can allow for lawful access without compromising overall security. Private companies must therefore ensure their platforms are not safe havens for criminals and provide mechanisms for lawful data access under judicial oversight. The debate should focus on achieving both security and lawful access, not compromising one for the other. And then on AI, AI is already discussed several times today. Again, I have to do a fundamental rights impact assessment on all the tools that we use. And again, this is for the possible violation of fundamental rights, except for me, at least, for data protection and privacy, which is done by the Data Protection Office. It is very important. A lot of artificial intelligence tools are black boxes, and it's not so easy to see if there is or possible if there is if there are possible violations of fundamental rights, as discrimination, for instance. So I apply an assessment. Again, as I said in my presentation, one that I developed at this moment myself, but it's based on dilemma training and on ethical assessments. So I do an ethical assessment of the tool, and then I write an advice also how we can use this tool. And it's also been mentioned, I think, before by the EDPS. Human oversight is very important. There is no tool in Europol where there is no human oversight when we use AI tools, and this is also always my advice. There are other tools, for instance, there are other measures, for instance, that we also try to test the data as much as possible to see if there are no biases or other problems with fundamental rights. So I think that at this moment, with the tools that we have at our disposal, I mean tools for doing this assessment, that we do our utmost to be sure that the AI tools that we use are compliant with fundamental rights, both on data protection, but also on the other fundamental rights. And with that, I think I have answered all the questions, Co-Chair.
Köszönjük szépen, Alerts úr.
Thank you, Mr. Alerts, for your replies. And that closes that point on fundamental rights protection.
Köszönöm, Alerts úr előadását.
I'd like to thank the JPSG delegates and thank you to Mr. Alerts as well, of course, for your presentation. And now Mr. Zarzalejos will take charge.
Thank you, Co-Chair Becky. And now we move to our next item in the agenda of this meeting, which is about the update on Europol activities linked to the war in Ukraine. We are joined by Mr. Jean-Philippe Lecouf, Deputy Executive Director of Europol, and in the Operations Directorate. And a very warm welcome to you, Mr. Lecouf. You will have around 10 minutes for your presentation before we open the floor to the questions from JPSG delegates. Dear colleagues, please limit your contributions to no more than 1 minute so that all delegates have the time to address their questions. All the questions will be put en group and will be replied en bloc by Mr. Lecouf at the end of this session. So, Mr. Lecouf, the floor is yours. Welcome again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon to you and to all the delegates from the national parliaments and members of the European Parliament. I will update you. There's a PowerPoint, I think, that will come on Europol activities linked to the war in Ukraine and the support to Ukraine. Well, Ukraine is one of the strong partners of Europol, and we have been cooperating with them very closely since the beginning of the war, but even before. This war of aggression launched by Russia against Ukraine. We have been continuously assessing, especially the threat linked to this conflict for the internal security of the EU. Okay. There's no PowerPoint, but it's not a problem. I will speak. Our support and cooperation to Ukraine centers on 5 main pillars. The first one is facilitating and enhancing the exchange of information between Ukraine and member states and third countries, and between Ukraine and Europol. Second, providing operational and investigative support through our 5 operational centers. Third, deploying guest officers on the spot in order to conduct real-time cross-check against Europol databases in support to national authority of the EU, bordering EU and a bit wider, bordering Ukraine territory, and delivering strategic support via threat assessment and analysis, and lastly, providing capacity building to Ukrainian authorities through training opportunities. Ukraine, as I was saying, is a long-standing partner of Europol. When it comes to the exchange of information, the use of Siena by Ukraine continues to increase, and between 2024 and Q3 2020, between 2023 and Q4 2024, we already noted an increase of over 20% of the Siena messages sent by Ukraine to Europol. These messages are both communicated securely with Europol and with EU member states. In addition, Europol has a Ukrainian liaison bureau at our headquarters in The Hague, and this bureau has 2 dedicated liaison officers. I want to spend also some time going through a few operational examples to illustrate the support that Europol has been providing to Ukraine, but also to highlight some of the key threats associated with the country. Europol supports investigation conducted by Ukraine and other countries on war crimes committed in Ukraine. Our dedicated analysis project, Core International Crime, collects various types of evidence of war crimes, data from various sources for storage, cross-checking, analysis, and when relevant, sharing with the relevant party. This AP-CIC, as we call it, received and analyzed numerous material related to potential war crimes events carried out in Ukraine. Europol further established also an OSINT, operational task force, on Ukraine, with the participation of 13 countries and 17 law enforcement agencies. This task force aims to help identify suspects and their involvement in war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide crimes committed in Ukraine through the collection and analysis of open source intelligence. This OTF has been effectively supporting 44 prioritized OSINT requests OSINT is the search that we made on open source information. Maybe I should have said that before. So open source information. And in this framework, in the framework of 23 investigations led by Ukraine or other partner countries, and also the International Criminal Court. Europol also participates in the joint investigation team on alleged core crimes committed in Ukraine alongside with 7 EU countries, Eurojust and the International Criminal Court. Another main threat linked to the country is the possible increase in firearms trafficking coming out of the conflict zone and into the EU. To respond to this threat, Europol and Ukraine have concluded an information sharing agreement in 2022. Since then, the analysis project Weapon and Explosive of Europol regularly receives data from Ukrainian authorities on lost and stolen firearms and seized firearms. Today, we have in our database over 500,000 lost and stolen weapons sent by Ukrainians and over 13,000 seized weapons for cross-checking. In addition, Europol continues to support Ukraine with investigation links to firearms trafficking. For example, earlier this year, Europol supported Operation Conversus, an operation led by Romania spanning across 17 European countries, which led to the seizure of nearly 1,400 weapons. Since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, Europol also announced the monitoring and the support to cyber threats. The European Cybercrime Center has partially activated the EU Law Enforcement Emergency Response Protocol for major cross-border cyber attacks. A full activation of the protocol could be considered if the situation evolves. We are especially monitoring between the Cybercrime Center and the EU Internet Referral Unit regular requests received from Ukrainian authorities or member states for the takedown of communication channels associated with disinformation. We also supported 2 joint investigation teams, for example, on payment fraud online, where Ukraine is a partner. Of course, Europol also supports Ukraine in all other crimes areas under its mandate through its 5 operational centers. Support is also provided under Impact Framework. For the period 24-25, Ukraine is the most active partner from the Eastern Partnership region. I want to specifically also highlight 2 other major initiatives. The first one is Operation Oscar. It's a money laundering and asset tracing operation launched by our Economic and Financial Crime Center in 2022 and supported by Impact. This operation works to identify potential links to organized crime, and this operation is still ongoing and continues to support member states and third countries in enforcing EU sanctions via, for instance, ongoing investigation regarding the violation of EU sanctions and recovery assets. We had also conducted 4 hackathons on trafficking in human beings, where some criminal groups try to target vulnerable Ukrainian refugees for THB. Europol has been deploying also teams of guest officers to the front line in European countries neighboring Ukraine. Currently, between 12 and 18 of these guest officers have been present in Moldova, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Lithuania, and Poland. These guest officers are deployed based on operational needs and in close cooperation with the member states, or for Moldova, the third country. And such number of guest officers varies continually to best respond to a situation that is always evolving. These guest officers, and I will come back to that in the next point, will conduct on-spot cross-check against Europol databases in support to national authorities. In addition to the operational and investigative support provided to Ukraine, Europol also supports the national authorities through capacity building opportunities. There's a list of some training course that was delivered to by Europol experts to Ukrainian authority, for example, on strategic analysis and other areas. Europol continues and will continue to support Ukraine to the full extent of our mandate. Our effort will continue to focus on information sharing, operational support, and strategic capacity building. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Monsieur Lecouf. And now we start a round of speakers, starting with Mrs. Caterina Cinici from the European Parliament. Caterina, the floor is yours.
Grazie. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. The prevention and coordination of an agency like Europol, as we can see, is fundamental in fighting crime, which has in part been developed by organised crime. And this means that that they are taking the opportunity of crises like the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. And so we are trying to fight human trafficking, which Ukrainian refugees have been exposed to. So I wanted to ask you, after 3 years now, unfortunately, of war, what is the level of risk when it comes to human trafficking? Can you give us any updates with regards to the first year, there were about 240 monitoring platforms and more than 30 victims, potential victims, were identified. So please, can you update us on the more vulnerable people, including women and children specifically? Thank you.
Alexander van Hattem from the Netherlands.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, Chair. So we're talking about human trafficking from Ukraine, but there's also this mention of kidnapping of people on the borders with Belarus and Russia. And so I wonder how much Europol is, how many resources Europol is dedicating to dealing with that. The second question, when it comes to the Ukrainian war, Iran also plays a part. Are there any activities, possibly illegal ones, carried out by Iran which are being surveilled by Europol? So I'd just like to hear about those two things. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hatten. Now the floor goes to Mrs. Raquel García Armida van der Valle.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask about one of the aspects supporting the problems we see with financial crime, and that's, of course, the involvement of corrupt practices and corruption in those criminal activities, especially when it comes to organized crime. We know, according to recent reports, that Ukraine has taken very big steps in addressing their issues with corruption in the country. That is really hopeful. I would like to know if Europol has noticed a reflection of these efforts on your activities, and if you would like to also maybe reflect on that and which way we're going, also looking to the accession of Ukraine in a few years to the European Union, if that goes according to plan.
Thank you, Mrs. García Armida van der Valle. Now it's the turn of Mr. Luca Orlando from the European Parliament as well.
I speak Italian.
Mr. Lecouf, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned Europol efforts in Ukraine linked to proof of war crimes. So my question is whether this is being done in collaboration with Ukrainian agents, and have they been identified by Europol? And if this is the case, how is this collaboration taking place? Do you have some information on the types of war crimes or the crimes being committed in war conditions? Because they can either be war crimes or crimes committed during wartime. So how does the collaboration between Europol take place with local authorities? There's collaboration in Israel, and then there are also the war crimes occurring in Palestine as well. And then we're seeing these being put to the International Court of Justice. Thank you.
Mr. Orlando, now Mr. Christoph Brezia from the European Parliament as well.
Dear chairs, dear members, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Europol for your engagement in supporting the brave nation of Ukraine. We see a potentially dangerous situation that relates to the very trained soldiers which are unemployed when they are discharged after the service. Unfortunately, after horrible war and violence, many times those soldiers have PTSD. Some might have issues finding normal jobs after war service, and that could be used by criminal groups who want to use their skills in warfare for their criminal work. I'm aware that this is a very specific topic for Europol, but does your organization view this as a potential problem? Do you consider any steps to minimize the possibilities of war veterans getting involved in criminal groups?
Thank you. And now our last speaker on the list for this session is Mr. Miroslav Gregoric from Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Lekuf, for the very good presentation. I have a very short question. On the last meeting, we heard that Ministry of Interior of Ukraine submitted a list of lost, stolen and seized weapons. And today we heard that this list is about now 500,000. My question is, does it include also the list from the Ministry of Defense that includes drones, manpads like anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, and explosives and mines? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gregoric. And now the floor goes back to Monsieur Lekuf for answering the questions that have been put to him. We will start by 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to answer all the questions. Well, for the THB, what we have seen is that it's a topic that we have taken very early at the beginning of the war, with a great sensibilization in an awareness session in the member states. And we have not seen, let's say, a wide materialization of these crimes. There are crimes. We are still working on it, but there are very few that comes to Europol as cross-border crime. And they are in the countries, but I think that the prevention that was taken, measures that were taken, were really followed by the member states, and we have seen few of them materializing. So it's quite, I would say, a success. About disinformation, well, disinformation is not part of our mandate as of today, so it's difficult for us to act directly on these questions, except if they are gone through a cybercrime offense. So I cannot give any information on that, especially on the involvement of specific country, as this was asked by the delegate, because we are not following clearly this question very closely, but maybe something to reflect for the future of Europol, and we are thinking about it, and maybe this the European Parliament will have to think about that. About corruption efforts in Ukraine, well, for sure I have met at least 3 of the different bodies fighting corruption in Ukraine. that came to Europol to get some information on how we do it and what kind of information they need to focus. So I would say that, well, the situation, it's not for me to assess, but I can testify that there's an effort made by Ukrainian authorities and some of these investigative bodies against corruption that are done in Ukraine, and they have contacted us on that, and we try to exchange information as soon, well, to receive from them information and to help them to build this capacity of anti-corruption. If we speak about war crimes, well, mainly what we are doing is that we are part of the JIT on the war crimes on Ukraine, and we are supporting our member states when they have started investigation on these war crimes in Ukraine. So we don't work directly with Ukrainians, except if they request us some information, because it's a specific situation on war crimes, because they are all prosecuted by Ukrainian authorities. So it's mainly Ukrainian investigating, and when we can help, we help them when we have the request and that it's possible to do it. We don't have, for the time being, any request from member states to investigate any case in another part of the world that you were mentioning. For the relation with the Middle East, we have a liaison bureau of Israel in Europol, because we had an agreement with this country before, but we don't work on this question of war crimes. For the fighters, I would say, and the question of post-war trauma, well, it's not in our mandate. What we are monitoring is the foreign fighters. When we know about some foreign fighters going to Ukraine to fight and that they may come back to the EU, we are monitoring these people as soon as we know them, and it's part of the job that we do with our guest officers that are deployed in the bordering member states neighboring Ukraine. So, but certainly it's a question that must be taken on board at some point when the war will finish. Our main concern today is about weapons trafficking and the massive amount of weapons that are in Ukraine, because we have learned some lessons from wars in the Balkans 20 years, more than 20 years ago. And for the last question from the delegate from Slovenia on the military weapons, well, military weapons are not in the databases that are sent to us by Ukraine. I mean, I think that he's speaking about anti-tank or anti-aircraft weapons. They are not part of the data that are sent to us by Ukrainian authorities, because we are law enforcement agencies, and I think this kind of information are exchanged between intelligence services and not with our agency as law enforcement. I think I have answered the question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Merci, Monsieur Lecouf. But we do not bid farewell to you, because we are having you in the next session, in the scrutiny session number 1. And now I'm glad to pass the chairing to our co-chair, Mr. Cosa, to conduct the meeting on the next, over the next session.
Köszönöm szépen, elnök úr, kedves vendégek, kedves kollégák. A következő napirendnél két...
Thank you. The next point on our agenda will also have an intervention from Mr. Lecouf. If you would like to take the floor, I would request that you fill in your speaker's card. We'd like to try and keep to the schedule as best we can. This part of our agenda is about security threats Unfortunately, this is something we've been able to witness. If we see what's been happening in our streets, it makes us think about the 30s of last year. If we look at the racism which has been witnessed, we've seen this openly in the street over the past week. People's safety was threatened, and therefore the Hungarian government thinks that it's important to deal with illegal migration, and we need to place this on our agenda. So we're very pleased to say that we're increasingly seeing the opinion that we shouldn't just control but stop migration. There's a difference, of course, between people who have applied for asylum and people who haven't. If we look at the southern border, for example, at the Serbian border, the border between Serbia and Hungary, then we see that Europol protects that border, and since the war began in Ukraine, thousands of refugees have fled to Hungary. We've received them, and this is one of the largest humanitarian actions in Hungarian history, if I may say so. If you look at the amount of refugees, then that's even more than the refugees we got from... Oh, if you look at the amount of refugees which went into Poland, the interpreter corrects himself, there are actually fewer than 30 illegal entries. So we worked together with the Polish border security to carry out these procedures legally, and here you can really see that people are fleeing for their lives. So a difference needs to be made between people who are really fleeing a war situation and others. We shouldn't mix this up with illegal migration. We really need to draw a line here. On one side you have people who are fleeing a war, and on the other side you have other migrants. That's very important to bear in mind. And earlier I also mentioned that the two largest regions in the world which deal with illegal migration, that is the US and Europe, the European Union, well, these regions, these are the main regions where this happens. In America, we don't have precise figures, but 20 million over the course of 4 years is an estimate. That's the amount of people who have entered the United States. We didn't have as many people coming to Europe, but that's going to change dramatically. We already said that illegal migration needs to be stopped, and in the US, it seems that they are also trying to do this. But if you look at illegal migration in Europe, if we only had 10% of the American figure coming into Europe, then that would lead to huge problems. For that reason, I think it's of crucial importance that we think about this, think about how we can stop illegal migration and how we can ensure the safety of Europeans. People who voted for us did so because they want their family and their children to be safe. And connected to that, we've decided to set this point in our agenda. I think it's a shame that This needs to be brought up over and over again. Here, for example, it's been brought up because of the attack in Solingen. So now we'll hear from Mr. Redvári and then Mr. Lecouf will have 10 minutes.
Köszönöm szépen a szót, tisztelt elnök urak, tisztelt hölgyeim és uraim.
Thank you, Chair, and other participants. We indeed need to protect the safety of the European citizens. It's also important to talk about things which used to be taboo. For example, the connection between illegal migration and security. This is something which you couldn't even speak about in the past. We see that citizens in the US have found that to be dangerous. If you look at research into this, 55% of people who have a negative outlook on migration, well, you see that 55% of people regard migration negatively. Only 27% see it positively in a European study, and people have noticed that there is more crime in their countries. 10% have said that this isn't the case, and 20% said they don't think so. So that's 30%, and that's gone down from 40%, and over 20% say that, yes, they are sure that crime has increased. That's the opinion that we've heard from people, and so we need to bear that in mind. For 10 years, Hungary has put up a wall against illegal migration. People say that this isn't a real solution, but we can see that we've had results. If you look at the Western Balkan routes, the difference is observable. We have 2 so-called fences in that route through Hungary. So people need to go around them. We see that Serbia is working harder against illegal migration as well. So migration routes have changed. And Austria, Slovenia, etc. also need to be thanked because they came to observe how we do things in Hungary. If we look at the migration paths, there are 3 countries which are currently carrying out action. Slovenia, Hungary, and Austria, along with North Macedonia and Serbia. The Hungarian and Austrian police officers have worked together, and there is decreased illegal migration there. If you act against those migration paths, if you put up an obstacle with a fence or other technical means, then it is possible to decrease this migration. Some people say that it's useless to act against illegal migration because these migrants will still make their way through. They'll use these different paths. But we can verify that it is worth acting. And you can actually influence these paths. Human traffickers shouldn't make these decisions, but the border guards should make these decisions. And I do want to invite people to come and see how these controls are carried out. You can do so. You can see that it's not impossible to set up physical barriers against illegal migration. Why is this important? Well, if people are trying to reach Europe in this manner, they are immediately acting against the law. Because they're coming from if they're going from a peaceful country to another peaceful country, so Serbia to Hungary, then that's not legal. because they're not escaping a danger. People smugglers ask for huge amounts of money. We heard earlier about 20,000 euros as a fee, and we have seen comparable amounts. If you stop these people at the border, then they will also communicate similar amounts. For a fraction of that amount, you can buy a plane ticket. So for 10% of that price, you can buy a plane ticket, but you're paying 20 times more, and that money goes to the mob to bring you into Europe illegally. So these aren't poor people taking advantage of these opportunities. These are people of comfortable means. If you look at people who are coming in illegally, then these people are using the mafia. So there's a lot of money being made in organized crime. And of course that creates more problems linked to security. If people come into Europe illegally through mob means, then they are choosing to act illegally. And unfortunately, we've seen this in a tragic way as well. People who, sort of drift from one country to another for tens of years. These people often take refuge in different countries, and we've seen that some of these people can act violently. People are born here and they aren't integrated at all into European culture. They become radicalized. And these are people who are born here. Sometimes people who have parents who are also born here. But some of them also carry out attacks because they aren't properly integrated. So sometimes even the second or third generation isn't integrated properly. And this is a huge threat because people are crossing the border, and we know that some of these are people who are wanted by the police. We need to be able to stop these people at the border. We've seen this here as well. When you look at if you're aiming for about 15 or 20%, then that's not a realistic goal. If someone is born here, goes to school here, and then is radicalized here and carries out an attack, that's a huge security risk for all of us. And of course, that also increases the chance of terrorism attacks. If we don't take this matter seriously, then we'll lose control completely over the situation. People who come in tend to stay in Europe. Sending them back almost never works. We try new measures time and time again. New initiatives are adopted. I've heard this from many police officers, and they say that it's not working. We have had experience with this over the past 10 years. If you're trying to approach the same problem and 10 years later you don't have any solutions, then clearly something's wrong. In Hungary, we found a solution by closing the border. We've been doing this as policy for the past 10 years. And in Europe, we're still asking the same question. Everyone talks about migration as one of the biggest problems in Europe. This was also the problem 10 years ago. So what's actually been done over the past 10 years? If the same question keeps coming up, clearly a solution has not been found. Hungary's solution is protecting outer borders. We've spent 10 billion euros on this to protect the outer border of Hungary. And we've stopped 1 million border crossings. So we would like Europe to regard this as a solution. Countries with a sea border deal with a very difficult situation. Of course, we need to help them protect this sea border. And this support also needs to be given to countries with a land border. The EU needs to provide aid to protect our outer borders. So as I said, we've spent 10 billion euros on this. We've received no help. And we actually got a huge fine for it. But we still want to keep strengthening the protection of our outer borders.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the framework of this joint parliamentary scrutiny group on Europol, I will provide you with some insight in how we as Europol are playing our role according to our mandate in fighting migrant smuggling, terrorism and other related threats to internal security. The Operation Directorate that I lead is divided into 5 specialized centers: Operational and Analysis Center, European Serious and Organized Crime Center, including the Migrant Smuggling Center, European Cybercrime Center, European Counterterrorism Center, including the Internet Referral Unit, and the European Financial and Economic Crime Center. These 5 centers supported more than 3,000 investigations last year. Each of these investigations have cross-border links. They are linked to serious forms of crime or terrorism. Often, they are also linked to some of the most threatening actors in the criminal and terrorist landscape. We as Europol provide expertise and analytical support to our national law enforcement authorities, in particular in those investigations where dedicated expertise or coordination or financial support is needed. Regarding terrorism, the overall threat of terrorism remains high, in particular the threat of jihadi terrorism. The current geopolitical landscape has a strong impact on the terrorist situation in the EU. And the threat is complex. We are dealing with lone perpetrators, with small cells, but also with larger networks directing individuals online, but also calling for funding and support at global level. Today, the main threat is coming from isolated perpetrators, radicalized online and pushed towards violent action by non-officially embedded media outlets and supporters online. This radicalization process is also facilitated and accelerated by the polarization in our societies and by the normalization of violent extremism narratives. We are also concerned about lone offenders who have not even embraced terrorist propaganda as such. Such perpetrators may be influenced by highly emotive content from media channels, including disinformation. We have seen in recent months attacks staged by lone offenders or groups of offenders. Online propaganda played a role in influencing several attackers, indicating a trend of rapid or recent radicalization. Several perpetrators pledged alliance to Islamic State or were linked to other terrorist groups. A worrying trend points to a younger generation of terrorist supporters and sympathizers, which is growing online. They are characterized by a high degree of ideological flexibility and a greater willingness to engage in violence. The violent radicalization of minors is a recurrent and growing element. This is highly concerning. It is a cross-cutting trend that requires closer cooperation and effective online content moderation. That's when we will be able to better identify those responsible for radicalization and detect the dissemination flow shared by these online personages. Social media platforms have allowed extreme viewpoints to gain visibility and legitimacy, contributing to a culture of outrage and hostility. Therefore, we invested in implementing the terrorist content online regulation. This regulation creates specific obligations for all hosting service providers that offers their services to EU member states. The providers are required to establish legal representation in the EU. They are also required to respond swiftly, within an hour upon receipt, to any removal order for takedown of illegal terrorist content online. Therefore, the role of monitoring online propaganda and online recruitment is key. In 2023, we launched a tool to do that, which is called PERSI. PERSI is now, it's a platform, is now the central solution for referral and removal orders within the EU. PERSI currently has more than 340 users. During the period from the 3rd July 2023 to the 30 September 2024, PERSI facilitated the processing of the following: more than 36,500 sent referrals and 1,140 removal orders that were processed. Soon, we will publish the EU Terrorism Situation and Trend Report, the TSAT 2024, which provides a situational overview on terrorism in the EU. This report will present figures, major development and trends in the terrorist landscape in the EU. Regarding migration, migrant smuggling especially, entry to the EU and consequently secondary movement remain among the main threats to the EU member states and continue to be high. For this crime area, we do not only provide support from our HQ, but we continue to have staff deployed on the spot on our guest officers, namely our guest officers. We support frontline member states with conducting secondary security checks. To recall, these checks are second-line security checks against Europol databases. Such checks are based on a referral by the member states competent in the country of entry. This exchange of information helps identify terrorist threats and criminal threats. By the end of Q3 2024, Europol guest officers were deployed to a total of 11 countries, covering 32 operational areas in 25 permanently staffed stations. The guest officers are seconded by the member states, and we are grateful for the nomination of guest officers that we receive from the member states. Guest officers are currently in a number of operational areas, namely Greece, Italy, Cyprus and Malta, the original hotspots, and now, since the war in Ukraine, Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Moldova and Poland. Just last week, I visited the guest officers deployed to Italy, in Sicily, in Catania especially, and I witnessed the first end of the work that they are doing when there is a disembarkation of a boat carrying migrants. I am convinced of the valuable contribution that guest officers make in ensuring the security of the European Union. To help the member states with secondary security check, we deployed these guest officers according to the operational needs and in close cooperation with the country. Europol is closely monitoring the geopolitical development. It is prudent to ensure that appropriate robust checks continue to be conducted on persons arriving along different migration routes. Terrorist networks could try to benefit from migration flow from conflict zones using already existing logistical infrastructure provided by smugglers. Both in the area of terrorism and in the area of migrant smuggling, we established several operational task forces focusing on high-value targets, those criminals or terrorist actors that play a key role in these networks. Recently, Europol Coordinated Action Day conducted on the 22 of October 2024 in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Law enforcement authorities from both countries arrested 16 migrant smugglers. The suspects are believed to be responsible for at least 12 incidents that saw a total of nearly 160 migrants being smuggled from Bosnia-Herzegovina to Croatia across the river Sava. This operation was conducted under the framework of an operational task force established in March 2023. I have another example in Bulgaria early this summer, but I am a bit late, so I will go to my conclusion. We have numerous examples of our successful operation in supporting member states, both with our migrant smuggling center as with our work on our counter-terrorism center and our internet referral unit. We will continue to support member states' law enforcement within the country and at the external borders to fight terrorism and migrant smuggling. And we encourage more efficient exchange of information among EU member states and the agency, relying on Siena, our secure exchange of information, but also on a very useful tool like the SIS, the Schengen Information System. And with better information, we can be more effective in fighting these terrorist and criminal threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lecouf. Now, ladies and gentlemen, questions, remarks, and answers. Please keep the time, 1.5 minutes. The first is Matthew Wellit, European Parliament. Please.
Merci à vous, monsieur. J'ai deux.
Thank you very much. 2 questions. The first is the passenger name record. Since 2011, we have been discussing this within the EU. I'd like to remind you that in Madrid, Paris, Brussels, London, Islamist terrorism has struck our capitals and our countries for 20 years now. We've been discussing this essential file now for 20 years when it comes to tracing the trips of these jihadist terrorists. We're looking at their journeys, their contacts, their communication, and the ramifications that this has had, and their preparation of terrorist attacks. So this is something that we need to deal with promptly. This year, the EU made a transitory agreement, but we need a more definitive agreement. The far left is afraid of surveillance, but whilst we are here discussing, victims are piling up. The Socialist Chancellor, Mr. Scholz, has put up put up checks on internal borders. We had this during COVID, and François Hollande also did the same. Do you think that this could be helpful? We spoke about external borders and Frontex, but do you think it would also be a good idea to use this to fight against terrorism, which is attacking our democracy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lecouf.
Yes, well, even if I am French, I will answer in English as a Europol member. Indeed, PNR is a very useful tool. It's not the only one. We are using all the services or the databases that are available to us to try to detect this terrorist threat. In fact, we are working also very